Hello, everyone. Tonight we're doing something a little different. Tonight we are going to be talking about senior Bible quizzing rules and trying to dive in and explain a few things from the rule book, bring some real world examples, and just try to share some knowledge and try to gain understanding. So we asked Brother Faubert to be here today, and he graciously accepted. So we're really excited to dive into a few things. These are things that we've encountered where we've had questions in the past. We know of other people that have, maybe just not completely understood certain rules or certain parts of senior Bible quizzing, and we just want to put this together and try and help everybody to learn something tonight. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what constitutes a cross-reference question. I'm going to bring up my screen here, and the first thing that we're going to talk about are cross-references. So what is a cross-reference question in senior Bible quizzing? It is a question that requires a complete answer from more than one verse. It requires searching, searching in more than one verse, and crossing or comparing or contrasting two different things together. If the answer comes from consecutive verses and flows naturally and seamlessly with no searching required, it is not a cross-reference. We're going to talk about that a little more. And if all parameters or the verse references are specified at or near the beginning of the question, and that means that there's no searching, you're not searching for what verses this is coming out of, that would not be a cross-reference question. Brother Faubert, do you have anything to add at this point? Did I do an okay job there explaining the rule book?
Yeah, I think that sort of pulls out of the word book some of the exact same terminology we use. Yep.
Can you talk a little bit more about searching and crossing, maybe put it into different words, those two specific things?
Well, we use those words because as a quizzer, I think you almost innately know that, okay, I found something and I'm searching for something else, right? However far that search has to be. The types of material you're typically either comparing or contrasting, right? Cross-references tend to do that. So we'll call that crossing of material. And so we've tried to use this sort of this normal modern day language to try to explain that process that goes on in a quizzer's head.
Gotcha. Now, there are a lot of examples of, typically when I think of an answer that covers more than one verse, I think of perhaps a why. Sometimes someone will say, or a said what, right? In response to something the lame man said, what did Peter say? And that may go on for 3 verses. But in that case, the answer is coming from consecutive verses and is seamlessly flowing, and the quizzer is not having to search for, skip any verses and search around. It just seamlessly flows. So
exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And the other thing, let's pull up our first example. Our first example is a cross-reference quotation question. So given what we just said, given that, if you say said what and it flows seamlessly one to the next, this answer seamlessly flows one to the next. It's a cross-reference quotation asking to quote consecutive verses. Quote the consecutive verses to speak of exercise. So why is when you ask a quizzer to quote 2 consecutive verses, why would that be considered a cross-reference quotation question?
Well, and it's always the verses, like back-to-back verses, that tend to trip people up in understanding cross-references. So there is a search and there is a cross going on even in this case, right? You are comparing exercise that's found in one verse and another verse, right? So there's your cross. If you locate the one, let's say verse 7, well, is it the verse 6 or is it verse 8 that's consecutive? So there is a search, however slight that may be. One of the other indicators is that it's really the question writer's prerogative whether they want to include the word consecutive or not.
That's a good point.
It's very likely that this question is just as valid if it were written, quote, the verses to speak of exercise. And in that case, you're right. It just so happens that they are consecutive.
But that doesn't have to be unique to that point, though. There could be 5 verses that speak of exercise. But 2 of them are consecutive, correct?
That's true. And I'm not typically, I don't typically write if there's 5 or 6 or 8 different times a word is used, but this one's special because it's consecutive. You're asking then quizzers to look at, 8-time words and then pick out which ones are consecutive and where's the limiter there. So I tend to stay away from that sort of exercise. And another clue is that a quizzer could actually satisfy this question by quoting verse 8 first and then quoting verse 7.
Yes, that has happened.
Whereas if in your previous example, if it was like Peter said what, and he rambles on for 3 verses, well, if he said the third verse first and the second verse, third, and well, that could completely mix up and then change the meaning of what's being said.
Right. Same thing, like quote the 2 verses preceding the one that speaks of blank, right?
Yeah. Right. So therein lies the difference, where to something flows naturally and seamlessly has to satisfy the question. Whereas in this case, you're just asking them to be quoted. It doesn't really matter the order.
Gotcha. Okay, let's go to our next example. Example 2 is a 2-part question. For what reason, according to verses 13 and 14 of Ephesians chapter 5, God saith what? So, obviously, this question is covering 2 verses 13 and 14 of Ephesians chapter 5. The reason why this is not a cross-reference question is because the scope of the question is, and when we say scope, I think it is very important that we define what that is. The scope of the question is the coverage that this question is covering. So, for instance, if it said, according to Acts chapter 1, and it keeps going, then the scope of that question is Acts chapter 1. If the question does not give a chapter or a book or a verse or anything, then the scope of the question is all of study. And it is inferred that it is study. It's not the entire Bible. That is something that I've always kind of thought about, how I don't know if that's in the rule book, but it is inferred that when a question writer writes, quote the only verse that names Pharaoh or something like that, it is inferred that it's referring to our study, not the entire Bible. Correct, Brother Faubert?
Absolutely.
Okay. But the scope of the question is whatever the question sets as the coverage. So in this case, the scope of this question is verses 13 and 14 because that is labeled in the question itself. And in that case, when it's done at or near the beginning of the question, where basically the only place that is smart to hit the question would be after you get those references, the quizzer should be getting the scope of the question before they get to the key phrases and the key parts to hit that question. So that makes this not a cross-reference question.
That's correct. There's no searching from one verse to the next. You're given the parameters within which you have to work. Right? You're not. So.
Right. Okay. Next example. This is a cross-reference 2-part question. Now, this question is coming from 2 consecutive verses, referring to the apostles in Acts chapter 1. Verse 9 records while they beheld what happened, and verse 10 records while they looked what happened. So, this is consecutive verses. So why? And it is saying which. It is giving both verses in the question. So why would this not be considered, or why would this be considered a cross-reference question?
So unlike the previous example where the parameters were getting given in their entirety at or near the beginning of the question, right? The bit of information that came prior to those verses was not enough to induce an interruption. Whereas in this case, you have one parameter, right? Verse 9, then you're asked a very crucial question, right? With key information, only then to be given the second parameter of the question. Again, it just so happens that they're consecutive. So because all of those parameters were not given up front like the previous example, then a quizzer is, again, in real time, they're thinking, okay, verse 9, while they beheld what happened, and they're searching for what other verse, and they're trying to they're contrasting or comparing information to pair with this one. There's your cross-reference in action.
Okay. So even though this question could have said, according to Acts chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, while they beheld what happened and while they looked what happened. That would be a fair question as well.
Yes, you may invite a contest to say that beheld and looked are in essence the same thing. And by including them within the same parameters, you're in essence asking the same question twice. In this way that it's written very smartly, segments it out so that that's not a point of contest.
All right, perfect. As we got thinking about this and talking about this, and it says as long as the scope is set at the beginning, what if a question writer like myself said, according to Acts chapter 1, verses 3 and 7, and then made a question? I've never heard or seen a question like that, but I got to thinking, that seems like by the rule that would not be a cross-reference question, and that would be okay.
That's correct, and
wow,
that's crazy. It is especially rare. I've not written one like that in quite some time. I have heard it, if I recall correctly, perhaps the last time that I may have heard it was from like the doctrine study, when like you've got a lot of verses from, let's say, Psalm 119 in a certain section where they're all sort of stacked one after another, but there's gaps, there's skipping verses within, right? You're picking out verse 19 and you're picking out verse 32 and you're picking out verse 43. And so they may say, just so that it's not a cross-reference question according to verse 19 and verse 23 or whatever it happens to be. And technically, that would not constitute a cross-reference question because there is no search involved. You're providing the quizzers the parameters up front.
So, like, for instance, if there were two verses in a chapter in which the angel of the Lord spake, let's say it's verse 18 and verse 25, I could say, according to Acts chapter 10, verses 18 and 25, what did the angel say? And that would be fine. I'm not saying I will do that. I'm just saying, like, that is interesting that is, like, that is okay.
So if I said,
sounds better as a cross, but
yeah, sure. If I said in each of verses 9 and 10, what was said, right, as opposed to in each of verses 9 and 12, what was said.
That is interesting. Now, that is something that I feel like has tripped up some quizzers, is the each of setup of questions. Each of these verses, if it's a two-part question, it's, according to each of the verses that say this, or, okay, let me think of an example. According to each of the verses that contain the word kick, who kicked who? But it's basically it's a two-part question, but there's really four answers, right? Is there any thoughts on how quizzers can really kind of approach that each of parameter?
Well, as a question writer, I hold myself to a higher standard, and I don't recall an instance where I've counted a quizzer wrong. Usually it's early enough in the question. Quizzers understand what is being asked. It's not something that trips them up. I would not require it of them. If they didn't say each, then they're going to get rung up. That's not what I'm. It is more grammatically correct, and I'm looking to contest proof my questions. As a writer, even if somebody stands up because they got a bone to pick, even if they don't break it down to the content, well, that's maybe there's something in there that I wrote that spurred them to do that. I'm looking to avoid that completely, as much as I can.
Gotcha.
So,
and I would say too, Philip, speaking about each of, even if it's not a cross-reference. So if you have a two-part and there's consecutive verses and both of them have a question, and the question's posed each of verses whatever and whatever of Acts chapter whatever, ask what, and it's only one question in each verse. You don't want to say what questions, because that's implying that each of them have multiple questions. So you want to say question, one question coming from this verse, one question coming from this verse.
Yeah, I think that has been kind of a struggle for some kids to treat it like a one-part question, but really there's two answers, right? It's like you phrase it grammatically in your question like it's coming from one verse, but really it's doubled up. So that's just something to think about. And once I do want to say, if anybody has any follow-up questions after this video or at any time, please reach out. You can send it to me through social media, or bqchats@gmail.com is an email address that I check. So if you have any questions at all, like we're always, I'm so thankful for a Bible quizzing community that has helped me through so many questions and so many times that I was confused. And so we do our best to try and help others as well. So, and if I don't know, I have a few friends that probably know. Okay, let's go on to the next question. All right, Paul in Ephesians chapter 6 refers to praying for me. Why? So this question takes place in one verse, but the answer covers 3 verses. So why is this not a cross-reference question?
Because it flows naturally and seamlessly from one verse to the next to the next. So there is no searching for, okay, what additional information, however slight. There is no crossing. There is no comparing or contrasting of material. It's just an answer that flows from one to now. If there had been even a single break, between verse 19 and verse 20, some little word or two that was inserted, like that would have been enough to break the seamless flow. And it would have to be written either with the parameters, according to verses 18, 19, and 20. Paul refers to praying for me. Why? But there is not. So, yeah, it's just sort of one question that with an elongated answer flowing through multiple verses.
Now, this has been an issue in the past for some of my teams, but we train our kids, or at least I do, and I think most coaches do, put the verse reference on the end of the question. Put the verse reference on the end of the question. Because a lot of times you need to have, at the end of the question, you need to have the verse because there's potential for another verse could answer the question in essence. So this is one where you say, forget everything that I've taught you. Do not say Paul in Ephesians chapter 6 refers to praying for me. Why? As recorded in verse 18 of Acts chapter 6 or Ephesians chapter 6. Then you would be wrong because your answer would not be the same answer as this question. So,
except that the question writer has already given you the clue that it's going to come from more than a single verse, right?
Yes.
By leaving it open to Ephesians chapter 6.
Yes.
So there's no need for the quizzer to tack on something extra at the end when they've already provided you the parameters.
Yes. If a question writer puts the chapter up front and then starts the question, that's a huge clue. Yes, that's
It
awesome.
is.
Yes.
And I would say, too, I want to bring up one little point because I've heard this argument be made a couple of times at tournaments. Seamlessly flowing is not dependent on punctuation or statements. Like, just because a Y or a phrase has a period doesn't mean that the next verse can't be a part of the Y that's being asked in the question.
Yes.
That's absolutely true.
That is a good. And another thing that Brother Faubert, you and I talked about last year was the idea of cascading wise. We can get into it a little bit, but I think it's Ephesians chapter 4. For the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, that each one of the next one is the why for the previous one, but the whys kind of cascade into each other, right? So there is a question where instead of saying why, it's just you say why, and they kind of all flow into each other, right? But then they could also be asked individually. The work of the ministry was for what, or something, or
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's always a fun one. There was some cascading thing this year that I don't even remember what it was, but I think Eric and I had a good conversation about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think he decided not to write it, which was a good.
I did not.
Good decision.
I did not. Yes, there's been so many awesome questions I have decided not to write for all of your sakes.
that's one of my my axioms as a question writer. Just because it could be written doesn't mean it should be written.
But it's so much fun, Brother Faubert.
Well, and as somebody who always, I mean, now that we've expanded to 6 sessions, I don't know that, well, I didn't have to write 2,600 questions last year, but you're always wanting more questions, right? You're really scraping to get those last, couple hundred. But you can't sacrifice quality or risk tripping up a quizzer just because, well, I need one more question, so they're just going to have to tough it out. Yeah, I just don't accept that.
Well, we appreciate that mindset.
I write enough bad ones without, intentionally compromising.
Oh goodness, yeah. I know. I imagine that you've had the same feeling, but you've heard your question read or read it yourself, and you just been like, "What was I thinking? What night did I write this at 3 a.m?" I have had plenty of those. All right, so this next example is an example of a faulty question or a mislabeled question. So this is labeled as a 4-part, and it says, referring to the council, Acts chapter 4 records they saw what, perceived what, took what, and beheld what. Now, the question you could argue is, it's flowing through the verses, flowing through these 2 verses. It goes, they saw what, and then it goes on to the next part, perceived what, and it goes on the next part, took what, and the next beheld what. So it seems like it's seamlessly flowing through these 2 verses. So why can't this just be a 4-part question?
Well, because the answer doesn't seamlessly flow, right? They saw what? They saw the boldness of Peter and John. Perceived what? Well, the word perceived is in the question, not the answer. So automatically, you've got a break in the flow. Right? Perceived that they were unlearned and ignorant men. And they took that, again, is in the question. So you're breaking the flow of the answer. So you've got all these gaps in the answer itself, as opposed to the previous question. The answer is what was seamless from one to the next. So it's not meant to be this puzzle where you fit the question and the answer to make a seamless thing. It's just the answer itself has to be seamless from beginning to end.
Gotcha. Okay, so the fix for this as a question writer would be referring to the council, Acts chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. Mm-hmm. And then continue on, because that would set the scope for the question, and then there would be no searching involved and no jumping around between any other verses. So
absolutely. Again, you think of it from the quizzer's perspective, and the whole point of having the cross-reference label was to help the quizzer, right? So the quizzer that begins a 4-part, you start, records they saw what. Well, they might jump to verse 13, but without the cross-reference label, they're thinking, all right, I've got to get 4 parts from this verse. as opposed to if you label it a cross-reference, or in this case, I would probably, as you already explained, include the parameters of the question, the scope, delineate that. Now the quizzer who is best prepared is going to get that first question. Okay, 13 and 14, boom, it's at the front of their mind. They hear that saw what, and that's all they need, right? And so you've actually set up the quizzer who is best prepared for the success and rewarding that preparation.
So, I mean, as writers, we should, if a question starts out in one verse and gives no warning that this question is going anywhere else but this single verse, we should, as question writers, stay in that verse.
Well, by default, that's what the quizzers are going to be thinking.
Right.
Unless you tell them otherwise, right? Unless you label it a cross-reference, knowing that, okay, we're going outside where I'm starting from.
Right. Okay.